Yes, we start. Uh, Good evening, all seniors, respected past presidents of the society, office bearers, managing committee members, and friends. I welcome all of you to this flagship event of the BCAS for the first time only on virtual platform. Till last year, it was physical with virtual availability. I take this opportunity to welcome and thank Shri P.N. Shah Sahib and Shri Arvind Dalal Sahib who are present for this virtual meeting, and also welcome today's speaker, Shri Pinakinbhai Desai. The BCS is a voluntary body of chartered accountants. It is known for its ethical and governance practices and quality contents and presentations with consistency year after the years. This is the 80th budget meeting held by the BCAS, including the indirect tax budget meeting held under the pre-GST regime. May I take this opportunity to give you more statistics on various long-term initiatives of the BCS. BCS itself is running into 73rd year of its continuous voluntary services and looking forward to its platinum jubilee in next 2 years. Our monthly journal BCAJ is in its 53rd year of continuous publication. BCS referencer is in 58th year. You can see the referencer announcement in the budget publication to be released today. The BCS budget publication, which we would be releasing in this meeting, is 28th year of the budget publication. This year, the preparation was virtual and physical, with around 20 people working on it and coming out with an excellent and timely publication. Recently, we completed the 54th edition of RRC, first time on virtual platform. BCS next ITF conference is going to be 25th edition, and many other international tax events are on the similar benchmarks. GST RSC is in the first week of June is in 15th year and is open for enrollment now. Similarly, internal audit, youth RRC and all other events are on its way to create its own benchmark in the times to come. All of you would appreciate that running a voluntary organization for 73 years and remaining relevant under the different circumstances is an achievement. And CA Deepak Parekh, Chairman HDFC, in his keynote address in our last AGM, complimented the BCS for the same. It is a strong foundation of traditions at BCAS on which today we build a structure of transition and transformation. The BCAS volunteer support and your participation with love and affection would keep the BCAS motivated for doing more and more. Coming to today's subject of Finance Bill 2021, with the increase in tax audit limits, removal of GST audit requirements, faceless assessments, decrease in the time limits for opening assessments, ITR filing relief for the senior citizens, and other measures to reduce compliances for the taxpayers, will it be an opportunity to the firm of chartered accountants to develop new areas of practice? As we observe, the devil is in details, and the policy announcement of infrastructure and healthcare boost with easy compliance followed by the efficient administration would make the life simpler for the citizens and taxpayers. Technology will play a big role in same. Coming to today's speakers, respected Pinakinbhai, this is an occasion which everyone awaits to personally meet and hear you. Pinakinbhai, meeting you personally is an opportunity for all of us, which we missed this year. But your expertise on the subject and a charming presence on this platform is also not to miss occasion for all of us. I, as a president of this managing committee, seek your blessings virtually. With these brief remarks, I welcome you once again and request Vice President Abhay to introduce Pinakin Bhai and request him to release the 28th budget publication in his hands. Thank you very much.
President Suhas, Chairman of Taxation Committee Amit Patel, Co-Chairman Deepak Shah, my office bearer colleagues, respected past presidents, other dignitaries and dear friends. It is indeed my privilege to share the virtual days with a person whom I and all in the profession look forward to as a role model for our profession. It is my honor to introduce him today for the lecture meeting. Respected CA Shri Pinakin Bhai, as we address him, is a man of less words and immaculate knowledge on taxation. Pinakin Bhai is a CA by profession since more than 47 years. Currently, he is a partner in Ernst & Young and heads its Tax Knowledge and Solutions Group, which provides technical support to the tax practice and is engaged in developing tax solutions and strategies. Earlier, he had been a senior partner in PD Desai and Company. Pinakin Bhai was a visiting professor in NM College for around a decade. In 1987-88, he was the president of Bombay Chartered Accountants Society, to whom he is addressing today. He had been the chairman of International Taxation Committee of BCAS for many years after his president term. He has contributed a record of more than 30 technical papers at residential refresher courses held by BCAS on the subjects of taxation. He has held positions of eminence at Indian Merchants Chamber and Forum of Free Enterprise. He has also served as independent director on the boards of companies. Pinakin Bhai was also a member of the editorial board of ICAI and other committees. Over the years, he has also presented various research papers at seminars and conferences of ICAI and many other professional and trade bodies on various subjects of professional interest. On personal front, I have always found Pinakin Bhai to be really down to earth and always of assistance to fellow professionals. Before I invite Pinakin Bhai to deliver his talk on finance bill, I request him to release the budget publication of BCAS, for which compliments goes to the chairman, co-chairman and the entire taxation committee for timely release of the function. I now request Pinakin Bhai to release the publication.
Thank you.
Over to you, Pinakin Bhai.
Okay.
Thank you.
Respected Sri Pradyumna Bhai, respected Sri Arvind Bhai, the President of the Society, other dignitaries on the virtual dais, seniors in the profession, and all my dear friends. We are here for discussion on, one sec, the screen we are not able to see. Yeah. Click here. Okay. Yeah. So we are here to discuss in a novel way a topic which is in fact a usual topic. And we are very, very lucky, and I'm so privileged that person of the eminence of Pradyumna Bhai and Arvind Bhai have been able to connect because of this virtual platform. Now, what do we look out for in the finance bill? And let's begin with what we would like to observe in the finance bill. And at the time of conclusion, we will test whether this is what we were asking for. Everyone, every year is asking for simplicity in law, but it should be a simplicity with some sort of reasonableness and fairness to the taxpayers as well. We will study the provisions which have been introduced in the current finance bill and probably answer at the end of this presentation as to whether the object of simplicity has been fulfilled, whether the taxpayer can be considered to be as happy whether he has been dealt with fairness and reasonableness, not only in terms of the tax that he has to pay, but also with regard to various compliance requirements which are expected of the taxpayers. Now, with this introduction, can we go over to some major developments before we go to clauses of the finance bill? The first noticeable feature which we find has been that there is a very high thrust on faceless assessments and faceless appeals. And we are now going to look at also the faceless appeals at the tribunal level. There are some doubts which have been expressed with regard not the success of this scheme, but with regard to the virus and the constitutionality of some of the provisions. While that's not my subject, let's also look at something which has come to our notice, to our study, and maybe it's a point for further presentation, a point for further debate. There have been a number of cases decided by the judiciary in the past where a taxpayer, when his appeal was, say, decided on the basis of written submissions, would have submitted to the court that the order is not valid for the reason that he was not heard. Opportunity of hearing means that it has to be an oral hearing. It was not at that time to be discussed whether it has to be virtual oral hearing or whether it has to be a physical hearing to take place. And courts did take a view that it is not mandatory that there ought to be an oral hearing. Order may be considered to be as valid even if it is based on written submissions. But in the course of that, there has been an observation that if there is a request by the taxpayer and there are special facts and circumstances of the case or the complexity of the matter were to demand, then giving of an oral hearing would be very necessary, and there would be violation of the principles of natural justice if oral hearing is not given. Now let's translate it. Whether can it have any relevance to what we are talking? Secondly, and which we can dovetail here, is that in the faceless appeal scheme which we are talking about, the discretion which may be there with the appellate authority is taken away. It is not for the appellate authority to even consider the request of a person, but if there is a request, then a hearing may need to be granted, where an oral virtual hearing suffice. And it's here that over the years, some decisions may be coming in, some challenges may be coming in. Now, if the scheme for appeal is going to be along the line of assessment, in the sense that there can be a review mechanism, there can also be a consultation mechanism, that some coaching may be given to the person who is hearing the appeal, mainly the commissioner appeal, then in such a case, will it be interfering with the principles of appellate jurisdiction of the persons? So probably I believe that unlike in case of assessment, in case of appeals, there may be some modification. Further, there could be a dynamic jurisdiction, and I do not know who is hearing me, and could a person change from a hearing to hearing? In such an event, there could be a serious challenge, because the principle of natural justice will demand that there should be a rehearing of the matter if there is a new incumbent. So after 5 hearings, if there is to be somebody else on the scene, I am entitled to, or in fact I should be told, to argue the matter afresh right from beginning. And then there could be a blank screen. Now this could be a blank screen. I do not know who I am arguing it before. At least in cases such as where a witness is to be cross-examined or a witness is to be examined, this is something which could prove to be very hazardous. I do not know whether the witness is answering or is it that he is getting prompted. I also do not know on a blank screen whether the same person is hearing, not hearing. I may get a conviction, but whether he is actually hearing or he is away from the machine, I again may not know. Now, on account of all this, there is a possibility. As I said, this is not my subject, but doubts have been raised. Person of the eminence of Mr. Parasaran has also raised the doubts. And my therefore submission would be that before we go further on to this, it would be good for the tax authority to obtain opinion either from the Supreme Court, as in the case of Aadhaar card, or from the eminent counsels to ensure that they do not fail eventually. Because if matters have been heard, matters have been concluded, and thereafter if we find that there is something which has boomerang, all the matters may need to be reheard again in accordance with the instructions. Now, secondly, as a feature, what we find is that there are 54 sections leaving out the internal subsections where power of notification or power of prescription has been taken. I think this is where control is not given up. Regulatory framework is such that it is not the legislature which will decide everything, but it is going to be the rule-making authority which will decide a number of things. Is it something which is desirable? For certainty of law, for kindness of law, and for the purpose of ensuring that taxpayers are treated more fairly, it would be good that as much as is possible is part of the act itself rather than being left to the rule-making authority. They can virtually interpret the provision in the medium of a rule. So it is the rule which will then become the law, and a lot of challenges can arise here as well. So my suggestion would be that this should be avoided. This is not a very wise practice or an advisable practice from a taxpayer perspective. With this, maybe we can go over to the finance bill proper. What we find is that there is no change in the rate of tax. Everybody had an expectation that there could be some additional tax liability, but that is not to be. But as a good departing feature, what we find, good in the sense that the tax authority considers it to be implementable immediately, but not so good from the standpoint of the taxpayer, that a number of very substantive provisions already known to the tax authority in the past are going to be enacted from the current financial itself. For example, goodwill is now not to be considered as a depreciable asset. For the past 10 months, people would have formulated transactions on the basis that, at least for the current year, goodwill is to be considered as a depreciable asset. Slump exchange is made taxable. Number of transactions may have been concluded in the last 10 months, and there also people would have taken a view that I do not have to pay tax on a slump exchange. Advance tax liabilities and indemnities may have been formulated accordingly. There is going to be a shortfall in the payment of advance tax as a result of these provisions. And a question therefore arises, can these provisions be considered to be retrospective? This government is wedded to the theory of no retrospective amendment. But are these the instances of retrospective? Or is it that the CBDT, the government believe that since the assessment here has not yet begun, They cannot be considered to be retrospective, but they are virtually in the nature of prospective amendment. I would personally believe that these amendments can be considered to be retrospective in nature. International literature will go to show that if there is no tax liability in respect of an event or a transaction on the day on which I am completing that transaction, but the transaction or an event is made taxable as a result of the amendment, then the amendment can be considered to be retrospective. If we were told that a slump exchange on or after 1st February is to be clubbed, then it would have been clearly prospective. Now, apart from the international literature, is there anything to show that this amendment is retrospective? And on some research, what we found that in the Finance Bill 2001, there was some amendment carried out effective from the same financial year, applicable from assessment year 2001-02. The explanatory memorandum at that time itself indicated that this is going to be a retrospective amendment. So it was not my view, it was the view of the person who presented the explanatory memorandum that this is considered to be a retrospective amendment. There is also a Gujarat High Court decision. Finance Bill 2008 carried out certain amendment. Of course, it was an amendment becoming effective from 2003. In that view of the matter, it was retrospective. Now, before the Gujarat High Court, there was a matter dealing with advance tax default and interest liability pertaining to the assessment year 2008-9. In other words, they were considering an amendment carried out in Finance Bill of 2008 becoming effective as well to assessment year 2008-9, and while granting waiver or reduction of interest, Gujarat High Court considered that to be an impact of retrospective amendment. So I think it would be gracious enough to accommodate within the circular of section 119 that in cases where there has been advance tax default, no interest will be payable under section 234C. In fact, on the ground of fairness, even for the purpose of 234B, it may be stated that 3 months' time may be given to a taxpayer to make good the advance tax liability, and if there is a default extending beyond 30th of June, then only 234B interest may be charged to the taxpayer. That takes us to the second amendment, namely depreciation on goodwill. One very major amendment proposed in this finance bill. We are aware of an intangible asset defined in section 2, subsection 11. Assets like trademark, know-how, patent, franchise right, any other business or commercial right are considered to be intangible asset. In case of Smith Security, in case of a merger transaction, question arose before the Supreme Court whether reputational advantage which is obtained for which a price is being paid, and there is an advantage obtained by which profit could be earned, could be considered to be an intangible asset. It was loosely called goodwill of the business. And the Supreme Court said that yes, it can be considered to be a business or a commercial right, and therefore it can be considered to be a depreciable asset. Now, in case of a merger, whether or not amalgamated company will get depreciation and to what extent, there could be another debate on whether, as per the provisions of section 43, explanations, etc., predecessor will be the base to be adopted or not, but that is a separate issue. On principle, goodwill was considered to be a depreciable asset. Stated alternatively, if, one second, can we remove this and I talk? Supposing we can, okay. Hmm. Hmm. Okay, fine. So on principles, goodwill was considered to be a depreciable asset. So in a case where I am supposing purchasing a running business and paying a price for goodwill on the authority of Smith Security, goodwill has to be considered as a depreciable asset. What is now sought to be provided is not that a case of merger is to be clarified, but that goodwill cannot at all be considered as a depreciable asset. This is an overreaction to what the Supreme Court said in Smith Security case. Now, what has been stated in the definition of intangible asset is little different from what has been stated in section 32, by which depreciation is to be actually allowed on the cost of an intangible asset. It would be good if section 32 is amended along the lines of section 2 into bracket 11, but I would believe that even if it were to stay as it is, it may not change the interpretation. Now, what we are now told that goodwill cannot at all be considered to be in the nature of a depreciable asset, even when there is a straitjacket business purchase agreement and an amount is being paid for the purchase of goodwill. Which portion of goodwill will be considered to be disallowable? I would believe so far as trademark or so far as franchise right, patent, know-how, etc. are concerned, they are used along with the goodwill at some places in the decisions as well, and therefore these specific items will continue to be depreciable. And I think it is not also an intent that this may be made non-depreciable, they continue to be depreciable. When it comes to business or commercial right, and goodwill is a part of business or commercial right, question may arise whether do I go by the meaning of goodwill as understood by the accountant? So do I go by the commercial and the accounting concept, or is it that every business or commercial right will now be considered to be in the nature of goodwill? A better view of the matter seems to be that we should go by an accounting or a commercial concept. Therefore, if there are some identifiable business or commercial advantages, they continue to be still depreciable, but it is only the residual goodwill component which may not now qualify for the purpose of depreciation. This will of course throw up some issues. Number one, to begin with, if over the years while formulating the block, I was not too clear on bifurcation of goodwill into different items, can I now do it and say that I am prepared for denial of depreciation, but it should be only with regard to that allocated cost which belongs to goodwill and not otherwise? Second would be that while there has been an amendment made to section 32, an amendment made also to section 50, there is no backup amendment which has been made in section 43. So if goodwill is already sitting inside the block of intangible asset, then in relation to the ongoing year and also for the future year, how will the block be disturbed? We often understand that block is indivisible, and unless there is something very specifically stated to take an item out of the block, can the block be disturbed? In relation to a slum sale, Section 43, subsection 6C has a special mechanism to take an item outside the block, but we don't find any such thing insofar as goodwill is concerned. Of course, an argument could be made out before the court, particularly in a case where right from beginning till the current date, no asset other than goodwill entered the block, and therefore the block is solely made up of goodwill and nothing else. In such a case, a good argument could be made by the tax authority before the court, namely that when the law says, the act says that goodwill is not at all a depreciable asset, how can some procedure be given a precedence and depreciation be granted with reference to such a block? But in a case where number of items are sitting inside the block of intangibles, this argument may or may not appeal to the court. Another issue which may arise is that if supposing in the past depreciation has been claimed, because up to March 20, I am entitled to claim depreciation, and there is some unabsorbed depreciation attributable as a result of my claim of depreciation on goodwill in the past years. In the current year, when that unabsorbed depreciation is getting carried forward, can it be considered to be current depreciation? And can it be said that in the current year, that depreciation also will be coming up for denial or disallowance? I would personally believe that depreciation which has been already allowed, question of allowing it over again does not arise. It is only a collateral adjustment which is made in the determination of total income, that under section 32(2), this is considered to be current year depreciation, subject to certain adjustments which are still required to be made. Now with this, can we go over to the next amendment? It's an amendment, slump exchange made taxable. I think on principles, we may not be able to object to it, except whether it should have been made prospective or why has it been made retrospective. What we are talking about is that section 50 capital B has a taxability provision for a slum sale. Supposing there is a business undertaking which is sold by A Limited and purchased by B Limited, then in the hands of A Limited, there is a taxability under section 50B if there is a slum sale. If the business undertaking, it may be a trading undertaking, manufacturing undertaking, entirety of the business or a division of the business, it can be considered to be in the nature of a slump sale, provided there is a debt created of a lump price and it is not an itemized sale. Most obviously, what we'll say will be that A Limited transfers the undertaking for 100 crore. An amount is payable by B Limited to A Limited. Another way in which it could be structured is that A Limited transfers the undertaking for 100 crore. B Limited has a definite debt payable of 100 crore. But there is a mechanism which has been set out by the parties for payment of that debt. So another transaction is also entered into simultaneously, namely that this amount of rupees 100 crore is required to be adjusted towards the shares which A Limited would like to purchase from B Limited. This is also an instance of a slum sale as explained in Pillai's case, Supreme Court, which has been referred to in the explanatory memorandum. But if a transaction right from beginning is so structured that B Limited does not have to make any monetary payment, the transaction is structured that A Limited is prepared to transfer the undertaking only if B Limited were to allot the shares to A Limited, and if that does not happen, the transaction itself fails. No doubt, for value equalization purposes, internally, both the parties will be looking at the respective valuation, but the transaction is structured as a slump exchange. Now, whether or not slump exchange is chargeable under Section 50B is a current controversy. Matter is pending before the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court were to take a view in the old years, namely that a slump exchange was anyway taxable in the past, then the amendment made today will become academic. Slump exchange would have become taxable right from beginning. But supposing the Supreme Court were to say that up to a certain assessment year, cutoff date of the amendment, slump exchange is not chargeable, then at least from the current year onwards, on account of the amendment, we would find that the slump exchange would become chargeable. So either two, if it is not taxable, then a seller does not pay tax, but the buyer does still get depreciation on the market value or cost on the basis of the market value. If it becomes taxable in a future year, then seller will pay tax as capital gain and buyer will be able to claim cost as his expenditure, depreciation, etc., etc. Let's go over to the next amendment, equalization levy. Google tax on the digital sales. Last year we found an amendment which has been made out. It says that let us take up that there is some electronic platform, digital platform. It is either owned or operated or managed by a non-resident who is called e-commerce operator. For simplicity's sake, let us consider that there is Amazon, which is an e-com platform. We were told last year that if any e-commerce platform, which is either owned, operated, or managed by an operator, because comprehensively, person will be called operator. In case of Amazon, it would be a case where, let's assume, platform is owned by Amazon itself. Now, if this platform is used for online sale of goods or online provision of services, let's consider this as a segment, then we go to the other segment. Then, with reference to the consideration received by the e-com operator, there is equalization levy at the rate of 2% of the consideration received or receivable. Now let's consider that Amazon platform. Amazon deals in its own goods as well. And I place an order on Amazon. I receive the goods physically by a courier. Question arose whether such a transaction where electronic medium has been used for placing an order, but substantially it is not an online sale. The sale is getting completed otherwise than on an online basis. Receiving delivery of the goods, passage of the title, the condition of sale will also say that I must receive the goods. I also have a right to return the goods within a certain time. Till that time, sale is not complete. One cannot say that it is an online sale because a very small segment is completed online. Either the entirety of the segment, right from initiation up to the conclusion, the payment should be concluded online, or in any case at least, a very substantial part of the transaction ought to be completed on an online basis to qualify as an online sale. Similarly, for online service, There is a musical concert which I join online. I enjoy it online. I had to connect it and interact online, and it's also concluded online. Everybody felt that yes, 2% amount will be payable by way of a levy. There is an added complication now that Amazon is not selling its own goods. On its platform, it is also selling the goods of a third party. Amazon probably may bill me, so it's a purchase by Amazon and it's a sale to me. Or it could be that Amazon is just receiving a certain commission or a discount, and everything else, the payment also has to be made to the third party. In such a case, if Amazon is the non-resident e-com operator, what is the consideration received or receivable by Amazon was the next issue which had come up. And here, an argument was possible that Amazon may be liable to tax on its own consideration. If the third party is also an e-com operator, he may also become liable with regard to the consideration which he receives, particularly if I have to make online payment and I am also directed to his platform, etc. But between the two, the total consideration may need to be shared. What is now sought to be provided also is that no matter that Amazon may be just entitled to discount or a commission, but e-com operator will be liable to levy with regard to the entirety of the consideration which is payable by a person. Unlike in case of TDS, a fictional explanation has not been added, but the intention is that from the platform, we will not be concerned with the share of the platform, but on the entirety of the amount, there would be equalization levy on the platform itself. Excuse me. Now, what is now sought to be provided is that if any one of the multiple activities is online, then the sale will be considered to be an online sale. The activities are acceptance of offer for sale, placing of the purchase order, acceptance of the purchase order, payment of consideration, supply of goods or provision of services, partly or wholly on the platform. So the net will now be very, very wide. Amazon, for effecting its own sale online, if any of the criterion is fulfilled, and Amazon, if it is facilitating the sale of a third party, because facilitation limb is also covered apart from a direct sale link. Amazon becomes chargeable with regard to the entirety of consideration. We are not giving a suggestion or an advice to Amazon. Understand this just only to be my own view of the matter. If I had to look at the matter for some e-com operator, Amazon might have a different interpretation of or a view with which we are not concerned. This is just an illustration. Now let's consider that you are not on Amazon, which at least is substantially selling third-party goods, but you are on some payment gateway. Payment gateway can also become e-com operator, and it has been used for the purpose of making gateway payment. Will it also be liable to tax with regard to the entirety of the sale consideration merely because he participated in the payment process? On a literal reading of the law, that seems also to be a plausible interpretation. And therefore, obviously, a question will arise that if multiple players who are operators are to be captured in relation to the same transaction, and that too on a fictional basis, then is there any chance of a double taxation or a duplicated levy? There does appear to be a chance of duplicated levy. And I think if I hear right, though it's on informal or a conference matter basis, that we are told that if it is visualized that any such probability or possibility is likely to arise, then we have already taken a power under the section to provide for a mechanism to relieve the hardship. We will do something by which such a result does not obtain. We don't know whether the mechanism will say that Amazon alone will pay, trader alone will pay, or a gateway alone will pay, or will it say that no, gateway, if it says that, get a confirmation from Amazon that Amazon is to pay, then you need not pay. Now, this is going to be mind-boggling, but we will have to wait for what those instructions are. The next topic that we take up is the definition of expression liable to tax. Section 2 has been amended to provide that a person may be considered as liable to tax in another country, provided that country has a definite income tax law and the taxpayer is exposed to some tax liability under that law. Alternatively, there is a tax which is computed in the hands of the taxpayer, but there is an exemption which has been granted. Even here, a person will be considered to be liable to tax. So if we are talking about a person who is in Cayman Islands, one Mr. A, and if I have to determine under the Indian law whether Mr. A is liable to tax in Cayman Island, now the answer would be that he is not liable to tax. But for the definition, he might have argued that so long as there is a sovereign power to tax him in Cayman Island, he should be considered to be liable to tax in Cayman. But now such an argument is not a possibility. But if I were to do whether a Mauritius company or a Mauritius person is liable to tax in Mauritius, in spite of the fact that tax might have been notionally computed and thereafter exempted, he will be considered to be liable to tax in Mauritius. Now, why has this definition been provided, and what could be the areas where we find that the definition may play a part? Take, for example, Section 6. A person who is not liable to tax in any jurisdiction whatever, but if he has got India source income exceeding 15 lakhs of rupees, then such a person is deemed under Section 6 to be a resident of India. So one has to determine whether somebody is or is not liable to tax in any other jurisdiction. For that now, this definition can be used purely for the domestic law. But consider a case that there is an individual who is settled down in UAE, or there is a company which is there in UAE, and we know that there is no income tax law in UAE applicable either to this company or to this individual. On account of this definition, is it likely that the DTAA eligibility of the individual or of the company will be lost? And the answer will be that no, that is not to happen. The reason is that so far as India-UAE treaty is concerned, eligibility to treaty is not dependent on liability to tax. Wording which is used in the treaty is materially different from what we find in some other treaties. So person will continue to get treaty benefit so long as he is there in UAE residing for more than 183 days, or a company is wholly managed and controlled in UAE. It has nothing to do whether there is a liability to tax incurred in UAE. Now take for example a German partnership, just illustration. And Germany, let's assume, has a method by which tax is not payable by the partnership, but is payable by the partners. Now under the Indian law, one has to decide whether a German partnership, which is a taxpayer before the India Tax Authority, is it liable to tax in Germany? I would have believed when they are defining the term liable to tax, they might have said that partnership firm will be considered liable to tax for the purpose of India law and India treaty, so long as either the firm or the partners pay tax in Germany. But that is not said. So a question will arise that is German firm liable to tax in Germany? And now if this definition of liable to tax is to be applied, and I'm not on litigation whether domestic law definition can still control the entirety of the treaty, that would be a very big debate that we enter into. But the assessing officer will now take a view that no matter partners have paid tax, so far as German partnership firm is concerned, it is not liable to tax within the meaning of this definition, and therefore treaty benefit is not to be given to the German partnership firm. Let's come back to an amendment which appears to be a mixed baggage. Is it something which is going to help the taxpayer, or is it something which will create impediment for the taxpayer? I am talking about reassessment proceedings, reopening of the past concluded assessments. The way the reference has been made in the budget speech, it is going to be a game changer. Maybe it is so, maybe it is not so. Now, before we enter into that, one thought which may be considered is that over the last 100 years, we have some methodology of how to conduct a reassessment. It has taken 100 years for law to get settled down up to this level, and it is still not fully settled. Now to say that just forget what all that was happening in the past, maybe you borrow some principles if that becomes necessary, and that is what the courts will undoubtedly do. But we are giving to you a new methodology and start interpret the new methodology. Whether right or wrong, provisions which we know over the last 100 years create certain amount of litigation which is unmanageable. Is it advisable to lay down a system which I am sure is going to be debated in certain respects for the next 20 to 30 years? I will set out what the law to me appears to be. If everybody feels that now what has been stated is so crystal clear that there is likely to be no litigation at all, I certainly stand subject to correction. But if there is a likelihood of litigation, then a methodology which is completely new, we will be creating precedents, and the assessing officer in India, as also the taxpayer in India, are extremely innovative when it comes to litigation. That attitude has still not changed. Now, with this remark, let us understand very broadly what is the current mechanism, and then we try to go over to the new mechanism. Current, what we find is that by and large, for a period of 4 years from the end of the assessment year, there is a greater flexibility available to an assessing officer based on information from which a belief is possible that income has escaped assessment. Income can be reassessed. 4 years from the end of the assessment year will typically mean 5 years from the end of the financial or the previous year. Even here we are told that if there has been a scrutiny assessment in the past, on a change of opinion, even within 4 years, it may not be possible in all cases to reopen an assessment. Beyond a period of 4 years, but up to a period of 6 years from the end of assessment year, assessment can be reopened provided in a scrutiny assessment it can be shown that it is on account of failure on the part of the taxpayer to disclose the facts that reassessment has become necessary. Otherwise, it cannot be reopened. For a period of 10 years, there can be a reopening only in such cases. I am emphasizing only in such cases because now the things are going to change. Now the 10-year period is to apply in all cases, whether or not they happen to be the such cases. And under the present law, there can be reopening for a period of 16 years if we are dealing with a resident who has an undisclosed foreign asset. But now that part has gone more to the Black Money Act and is no more likely to be a matter within the Income Tax Act. So what we find that by and large, if we cross a period of 4 years and the assessee believes that he has given all the material facts, not the interpretation of law, but the material facts, then reopening is not possible on the basis of change of opinion. It is not possible on the basis of adverse court ruling. It is not possible on the basis of audit objections. It may be possible in the such cases. Let us in this slide look at what the new provisions are. And what we are now told on a magic thing is, forget 4 years, forget 6 years. Now concentrate on a time limit which is far truncated, namely a time limit of only 3 years. And what a major magical advantage this is going to be. Yes, indeed, I must say, on a very fair note, that a number of safeguards have been provided in order to avoid reassessment. But having said that, let us look at now time limit of 3 years applicable in which cases, and when can this reassessment be done? What are the safeguards subject to which this reassessment can be done? Now here, distinction needs to be made between a search case and non-search case. In a search case, we are told that the very fact that there has been a search means that there is an information which warrants a reopening. So no further condition needs to be fulfilled. On an automated basis, if the officer so believes, he can reopen an assessment. And I think that seems to be reasonable and fair enough. Barring those cases, and we are dealing only with the 3-year time limit cases, barring those cases, there can be reopening only when, and I'm saying only when, there is either an information received against the taxpayer by virtue of a risk management strategy of the CBDT, or it is based on final objection which is indicated by the Controller and Auditor General of India. So there is going to be a lot of reliance on the risk management strategy of the CBDT. I have not seen the strategy. I think it's not public. We do not know the norms, but one can expect this to be fairly robust. They will incorporate all the information which is received from different agencies on an automated basis, say from the GST platform, from FATCA platform. They may receive information received from the third countries. They may receive information which may even be in the form of such some allegations, etc., newspaper report, etc. If there is a Volcker report type of a report published, then that will also be accommodated. And court decisions may also be captured. As a result of everything which is assimilated, artificial intelligence may throw up that, look, here is a case where there appears to be an escapement of income. So on a sample basis, the risk management strategy will throw up information which suggests that there is an escapement. But merely because there is an information, can an assessing officer proceed to issue a notice for reassessment? And here the answer is clearly no. In fact, very, very fairly, the law itself says that everything will have to travel 4 different layers before a notice of reassessment can be issued. So on the basis of the information, assessing officer will take a view that is this an information, if I consult the records of the taxpayer, warrants that a further inquiry is required to be made. In consultation with the higher authority, he has to take a view whether further inquiry is necessary or not. Thereafter, he has to give a notice to the taxpayer where he has to reveal what the information is, and he has to reveal why it appears income has escaped assessment, and the view of the taxpayer is sought to be sought. Taxpayer will respond to him. On the basis of the taxpayer, he has to then take a view after considering everything. Does it appear to be a fit case for reassessment? In consultation with the higher authority, he has to take a view. If they believe this is a fit case, they have to record that by way of an internal order, first as an internal order, and that order is to be passed again with the consent or approval of the higher authority. Thereafter, he gives a notice along with that order to the taxpayer, and that notice is also to be issued once again by seeking an approval of the higher authority. So these are the safeguards which are provided. Now, if we go back to the old law, we have been told that wherever a higher authority has to give an approval, he cannot give that approval mechanically. He has to give that approval after application of his mind. So in terms of future litigation, what can happen is that if in litigation it appears that any one of the 4 approvals which was given was mechanically given, all the facts were not produced, there is no proper application of mind, then probably the reassessment proceedings may fail. Now let's go over to not a case of 3 assessment years, but a case of 10 assessment years. Now there is no such thing as 6 year, but it is a case of 10 year. And this is a time limit which will now apply to all the SSCs, whether or not there is a search case. How to initiate and how to conduct, there is some difference between a search case and any other case. But what you find is that essentially the 10-year limit can apply in all cases. Now, what are the conditions subject to which 10-year condition be initiated? Before we enter that, I need to make one aspect clear, namely that there is a grandfathering provision, and I think it's a very fair provision. We are told that in relation to the old years, the 6-year time limit will still be respected, and the 10-year time limit will be applicable to the new years. So if there is any past year which is required to be reopened, and as per the conditions then prevailing, the 6-year time limit has expired, then reassessment cannot be carried out under the new law. But in relation to the new assessment years, the 10-year limit, of course, will be open as it should be. The conditions which are required to be fulfilled are that the assessing officer is in possession of books of account. He is also in possession either of books of account or some evidence or some document which goes to show that for a given assessment year, income of rupees 50 lakhs or more has escaped assessment and it is represented by an asset. Cumulative conditions. Either document or evidence or books of account, and it must reflect that it is represented by an asset for an individual assessment year. Now, what will be the meaning that we give to represented by the asset? If there is authentic document which goes to show that there was an expenditure incurred, but today it is not translatable as an asset, then is it represented by an asset? Represented as on what date? And a view is possible, though it could be debatable, namely that on the date of incurrence of the expenditure, a person was in possession of an asset, it could still be considered to be represented by an asset, though on the date of inquiry or receipt of the information, asset may still not be available with the taxpayer. But that's debatable. That could be one area where a challenge could lie. Now here, 10-year time limit. This condition, let us assume, is fulfilled. We are told in this behalf that in a search case, if an assessment is to be reopened, then even for using 10-year period, Section 148 capital A safeguards, that is the 4 safeguards that we talked about, they will not be applicable to search cases. In other words, in a search case, but after satisfaction of the condition, namely books of account, which will be, of course, in his possession because our search is conducted, or on the basis of some further document, evidence, etc., it is possible to take a view, and the court will demand a reasonable satisfaction at least, that income has escaped assessment and it relates to a specified year, then without that procedure of the 4 layers which are carried out, reassessment notice can be issued asking for a return of income. So what happens in a non-search case? And very interesting issues may arise. Having said that, in a search case, Section 148A procedure need not be followed, is it implicitly now also saying that in every other case, procedure will be required to be followed, and it is only thereafter that even for the purpose of tenure, the reassessment notice calling for a return of income can be issued by the assessing officer? Now that appears to be a plausible interpretation. I think we'll have to wait for further reading, deeper reading by all and taking a view thereon. There would be some clarifications coming in as well. But this is probably not all. Now let us take a view that Section 148 procedure is required to be adopted. And in Section 148 capital A, we are told that information which is required to be processed is what is coming in from a risk management strategy or from the Controller and Auditor General of India. Supposing there is an evidence available, there are books of account available, there is a document available, but perhaps it is not thrown up by the risk management strategy. If we presume that a risk management strategy will inbuilt feed this data and throw it up as a risk, then in that case, Section 148 capital A will also be attracted and procedure can be adopted. But supposing there is evidence, but nothing is possible, nothing is available in terms of risk management strategy. In such a case, can there be independent reopening? Because the term information has been defined to accommodate only the risk management strategy information and the Controller and Auditor General thrown information. So issues can arise where I would personally feel it should be plausible to still undertake a reassessment. Somebody may come up and say that no, the whole procedure may fail and therefore reassessment may not be possible at all. We'll have to wait and see. But if either there is a suitable correction made, or if it is implied that a risk management strategy in any case will throw up such a matter, in addition to there being a document or an evidence, then this inconsistency is not likely to arise. Now, the way the provisions are worded in relation to the 10-year period, if I am not wrong, some good relief may be available to the agents of non-residents. They are likely to attract a time limit of 3 years because in their case, it is unlikely that the precondition of some document or some precondition of books of account, etc., may be available, and an notice is required to be issued within a given period. So looks like that there could be some relief available to the agents of non-resident, but that is something which we'll still need to look at little more deeply. Now, with this limitation of 10 years, in a transaction where indemnities are called for, will a person now ask for 10-year indemnity, or will he be happy with 6-year indemnity? Will somebody theoretically say that now the risk exposure is higher, even in a not such case, therefore a higher indemnity period is covered, and this is going to be extremely important in transacting certain items between the parties. As also for the audit provisioning, now the exposure may be to the extent of 10 years. Now that takes us to another provision which is highly controversial, very, very relevant to all of us, to an extent bread and butter, and the provisions relating to the partnership firms. Section 45, subsection 4, which is presently available, is to be given a go by. There will be reincarnation of two new provisions, section 45, subsection 4, and section 45, subsection 4, capital A. To say the least, to me, they seem to be raising ambiguity. I think it may be better, instead of the clarifications, that the sections are worded little differently so as to express what the communication received by the readers is. A number of questions appear to me to be left open, but I'll stand subject to correction if any other reader were to feel that no, the language is absolutely clear. Between the two new sections, number one, I do not know the exact scope of the two of them. Are they supposed to operate simultaneously, cumulatively, or are there two silos where if one applies, the other one does not apply? Subsection 4 will apply in a case where there is a capital asset which was given by the firm to a partner, whereas 4A will apply where money or other asset is given by a firm to a partner. Money or other asset. Other asset will mean other than capital asset, or will it mean other than money? Third, 45(4)(a) has a reference of something happening in excess of the capital account of a partner, whereas subsection 4 is referring to something which can happen represented by the capital account, and represented to me appears to be, the intention seems to be up to the amount of capital standing in the books, and beyond the capital goes to subsection 4A. Then in subsection 4A, there is a reference once again towards the end to such capital asset. Such capital asset, does it refer to the firm? Does it refer to the partner? And if it refers to the firm, then money or other asset, will it refer to capital asset, or will it still refer to other asset including the stock in trade? So will 4A be attracted and capital gain will be charged even if the stock in trade is allotted, or only if a capital asset is allotted? Now, these are essentially the questions where there is not a happy reading, and our submission in representations may be to clarify the matter, to reword the sections. I gave references to, which I will maybe by illustrations explain, up to and exceeding the capital account. So what is meant by credit to the capital account? And what it means is that on the event which is taking place, what is the capital account of a partner ignoring the revaluations which might have been carried out. Over the past year, prior to dissolution or retirement, capital might have been introduced, might have been withdrawn, again introduced, again withdrawn. But as one option, what it looks like is that capital account balance as on the date of an event. Though it is possible also to argue for somebody that no, it talks about capital account as on the date on which an asset is received. So in the intervening period, if the capital account has changed, what happens we do not know. Will capital include current account, loan account? We do not know. So these are once again areas of litigation which will become very ripe. But subject to all this, and let's just toss a coin and say, what is the interpretation as it appears to be? I am using the word as it appears to be. I don't think it's a reason to believe satisfaction, but as it appears to be. Let's take case of a partnership, a simple case where there are two partners. A and B are two partners. Capital account of each of them is 10 lakhs each. And on the other side is the book value of a fixed asset purchase, land purchase of 20 lakhs of rupees. No other asset or liability. Now there is a dissolution, and on dissolution of the firm, asset is distributed between the two partners. Now in such a case, asset value, supposing it is 2 crore of rupees, so from 20 lakhs, there is an appreciation by 1 crore and 80 lakhs of rupees. So we are told that partners will be getting something in terms of value much in excess of the capital account of the partner. So value received by the partner 2 crore minus the capital account 20 lakhs of rupees, 1 crore and 80 lakhs will be considered to be the capital gain liability of the partnership firm. The way it is worded, it is trying to convey as if profit and gain which is received by a partner in the process of dissolution will now be taxable in the hands of the partnership firm as if it is the income of the partnership firm and it is the capital gains income of the partnership firm. It does not necessarily say will be deemed to be long-term capital gain, and therefore some area of dispute will arise there itself. In our illustration, we have a very simple illustration of only one asset. If it is long-term, fairly the gain will be taxed as long-term capital gain. But in the process, you don't get any indexation benefit because what we are told, value minus the cost as determined. So probably indexation will be factored and not 1 crore 80 lakhs, but minus something is also a view one can take, but we'll have to wait for what exactly is the intent. Better view is give indexation and then determine what the capital gain is. Now let us take the very same illustration. Capital 10 lakhs each, book value on the other side 20 lakhs of rupees. There are not two partners, but say three partners. The third partner does not have any capital. Now Mr. A, who is a 50% partner in this particular partnership firm, retires. It's not dissolution, but he retires. Going by 2 crore of rupees being the market value of the asset, Mr. A 50% share will be 1 crore of rupees, and on retirement he will be asking for an amount of rupees 1 crore as the amount required to be paid to him. The firm takes a call and they say that we will pay the amount in cash to Mr. A. There is a borrowing which is effected and Mr. A is paid cash. Asset continues to remain with the partnership firm. Clearly, subsection 4A will be applicable. Clearly, subsection 4 cannot apply because capital asset has not been distributed. Money has been paid, distributed, so 4A will apply. We are told amount paid by way of money minus capital account balance of the requisite partner, that is an amount of rupees 90 lakhs, will be considered to be the capital gain which is payable by the partnership firm. So even in a case where it's only money distribution on retirement, now that money distribution will also be brought to tax in the hands of the partnership firm. But now we are told, and that seems to be a good intention provision, that an amount which is paid by the partnership firm up to 90 lakhs of rupees, it is as if that the partnership firm has purchased the interest of a partner and invested rupees 90 lakhs in the acquisition of some asset. So these 90 lakhs of rupees is likely to be permitted to be apportioned to other capital assets of the firm or the retained capital assets of the firm in such manner which is to be prescribed. In the illustration which we have taken, there is only one asset, namely land. So if I am right in my understanding, 90 lakhs of rupees will be added as the cost of acquisition of the land which is sitting inside the balance sheet of the partnership firm. 20 lakhs is already the cost on the balance sheet. Another rupees 90 lakhs will be added. And as and when in future this asset is sold, the cost of acquisition will be considered to be 1 crore and 10 lakhs of rupees. Whether or not indexation is permissible is a matter required to be studied in a greater detail. We'll also need what the prescribed rules or the notified subject matter is. Now let's alter this illustration. Same illustration, 10 lakhs of rupees each. There is land of 20 lakhs of rupees. Mr. A has retired and he is to be paid a sum of rupees 1 crore. Now in lieu of this 1 crore of rupees payable to Mr. A, he is not paid in cash, but 50% of the co-ownership interest in the hands of the partnership firm is allotted to Mr. A. Partly the asset is going away and partly the asset is available still to the partnership firm. Now, how do we look at this? This is a case where capital asset is distributed to an extent, 4 is applicable. It is also a case where something is given in excess of the capital, so 4A is also applicable. This is something which is difficult to decide. Depends on what meaning that we give to represented by capital. But what it looks like is that out of 1 crore worth of asset which is given, up to 10 lakhs of rupees, you appropriate the amount to subsection 4. This is a plausible answer. Appropriate an amount to subsection 4. It is as if value realized, but cost of an asset is in any case more than value realized, so no further capital gain under subsection 4. But so far as subsection 4A is concerned, value which is distributed, namely 1 crore, to the extent it is in excess of capital, 10 lakhs of rupees. So this 90 lakhs will once again become taxable though it is a distribution in the form of a capital asset on the theory that other asset in subsection 4A will also include other than money or capital asset. Now here also 90 lakhs can be considered to have been invested back by the firm. This will be added as the cost of acquisition of a residual asset which is still remaining inside the partnership firm, namely 50% of the co-ownership interest. Let us take up another and the last illustration. We keep the facts as they are. But on the balance sheet, what we have is an asset which is stock in trade and not a capital asset. Now what we find is that amount which has been paid to Mr. A is a crore of rupees in excess of his capital account. So 90 lakhs of rupees is an amount to be brought to tax as capital gain, because whatever that is assessable can be assessed only as capital gain. No matter composition of the asset could be intangible, stock in trade, or capital asset. If there is to be a taxation, it will be only as capital gain. Now in this case, there is a reinvestment. Now reinvestment is to be added back as cost. But it is to be added back as cost in the working of section 48 cost of acquisition of an asset which will come up for transfer at a future date. Section 48 deals only with a capital asset. That means if the only surviving asset is stock in trade, though the law may intend that invested amount is to be added back, there is no mechanism by which it can be added as cost of stock in trade, because power has been taken only to distribute that to one or more capital asset if it has to draw reference from section 48. This is going to be highly complicated when we find that the composition of assets would be varied composition and we do not know the manner in which cost is to be attributed to different assets under section 48. The new provision is to apply not only to retirement or dissolution, but will apply also to reconstitution, including admission. Mere change in the profit sharing ratio, will it be reconstitution? If we go to the history of some of the cases under section 187, where today reconstitution is defined, but for the purposes of section 187, some of the old cases go to show that a mere change in profit sharing ratio is not in the nature of reconstitution. A view will need to be taken thereof. Supposing there is an assignment of partner interest, will it be reconstitution? Now it could be a private arrangement between the partners. Other partners may not even know about it. So there is no change in constitution. Also, there is nothing which is paid by a partnership firm to a partner. One also wonders whether the charge is to be created on a cash method of accounting, because reference is to money or other asset received. So if it is received over a period in installments, how is the capital gain to be determined is also likely to be challenging. But what we now find is that both the newly added sections are notwithstanding anything contained in section 45(1). In other words, that if mechanically, arithmetically, and on a literal reading, liability is arising, we may not have to ask a question whether is there a transfer of an asset by a partner or a firm, Section 2, subsection 47 transfer may not be relevant to be examined. This could be considered to be independent charging provisions. I am aware I took them in a greater detail, but I thought from a BCA participation perspective, this might be of some relevance. With this maybe over just 5 to 10 minutes, I may like to run over some of the provisions very quickly. I don't think we'll be able to complete everything, nor is it necessary to do that. So settlement commission is going to be just abolished. We will not see the settlement commission. Transit cases will be dealt with by an interim board. Authority for advance ruling will continue to be functional for some time, but over a period it will be phased out. Now, somebody wants to withdraw from AAR, knowing it that now the future is going to be uncertain. Can he do that? I think so long as the current AAR is functional, they might be liberal in granting you a withdrawal because they have done that in the past. But even the interim board, which will eventually take over and which will run over a period thereafter, will also have the same power which is available. In case of settlement commission provision, express right is given. I'm told that if you want, you can withdraw, but that will have different complications with which we are not concerned. For AR, we are not told that, but it would be good even for AR to give such an option if a person wants to withdraw. An alternative forum, dispute resolution committee for small taxpayers, is sought to be formed. Intention may seem to be good, but I think it's a committee going to be composed or comprised of the commissioners of the tax authority, and therefore there may or may not be a very high confidence level on the part of the taxpayer whether to approach or not to approach. But if it does function well, maybe in small cases it will work out well. The statistics of the tax department is that large number of appeals pertain to this area where returned income is less than 50 lakhs and the variation to income is also less than 10 lakhs of rupees. The carrot which is offered and as a result of which probably it might pick up is that this committee will have power to grant waiver or reduction of penalty. It can also give immunity from prosecution. So if internally the tax authority, except in case of some apparent evasion, were to be liberal in avoiding penalty and prosecution, then it's a good carrot which could be offered. Condition can be laid down that we are prepared to grant you immunity provided that you don't go in any further appeal. They have a power to give immunity subject to conditions. And I think the last of the provisions that I refer to is TDS at punitive rate in case of non-filers. This is not a substantive provision in a sense, but it can add to lot of compliance issues, and therefore there may be a reconsideration. What it says is that if supposing I am making any payment on which tax is required to be paid or deducted at source, if I'm making payment to a person in whose case overall TDS and TDS exposure is more than 50,000 and In my case also, I find that it's not just 10, 20 rupees, but is a decent number, but which is very low in the current economy. Then in that case, if the other person has not filed the return of income in any one of the 2 years preceding the year in which I am making a payment and for which 139(1) time limit has expired, then I have to conduct TDS at double the rate compared to what could be the normal rate of tax. Let me take an example. I have taken on rent a residential property and I'm paying rent of 10,000 rupees per month in respect of this property, 1,20,000. I am told that at the rate of 5%, in the very last month, I can deduct tax at source. So in the month of March, April, I will need to decide that tax is to be deducted and I have to make a payment. While doing that in the month of March, I will have to go over to the utility of the CBDT and find out whether the landlord has or has not furnished the return of income in any one of the 2 years by reference to the PAN number. And I believe that robust mechanism will be created, but I will have to take care to see to it that I examine technologically the utility, feed the correct name, feed the correct PAN number, and verify whether I should deduct tax of 60,000 or 1,20,000. But we are told that if your rent itself is 1 lakh, then don't exceed that amount. It will be 1 lakh of rupees. Now take another example where I'm renting an office. Now that office 1 lakh per month. In case of an office, unlike in case of a residence, I have to deduct tax every month. In other words, every month while I am doing the TDS compliance, for each one of the parties on the other side, I must go over to the utility and then try to verify whether he is a non-filer or has he furnished a return of income. April and May, he might be a non-filer. He may become a filer again in the month of June. Do I make adjustment? Do not make adjustment? All those issues will arise. There would be virtual fight and misunderstanding between the payer and the recipient because the recipient is going to resist. How do we explain what the provisions of law are? But they are very innovative provisions, not to say that they need to be implemented. I think there is enough of compliance, there is enough of data available, there is enough of cross-check available, and there is no reason why people should be bogged down to compliance. What is simple is not only in terms of the rate of tax may be reduced to 17%. That reduces my exposure, but that does not reduce the agony that I pass through for the purpose of compliance with law. So I would personally believe that if we need to make law simple, then compliance should also be made simple. And not only for that, I think for the happiness index of the taxpayers and for the purpose of diverting people from the mundane compliance job to go over to something which is more innovative would be a better option. I am aware there could be a reaction that don't look at anything manually. Your own software may be so modulated that you will also get some information on the spot. But we must remember that we are talking about a very large population, and this may or may not be technologically sound for everyone to say that we are tick marking a provision. Now with this, it's up to you to decide, Has the budget made the law simple, and are we in the right direction? Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Pinakin Bhai, for your masterly analysis and sharing your wisdom with all of us. There are 1,400 plus beneficiaries of your analysis, and the highest on the virtual platform of the BCAS. There were some difficulties faced by the participants in login, so we are extremely sorry for the same. However, we are going to upload this event on BCAS YouTube channel. So please, those who have missed, please visit our channel and take the benefit. May I request all the participants to wait for a few minutes for vote of thanks and few announcements by Treasurer Chirag Doshi. Over to you, Chirag.
Thank you, Suhas bhai, and thank you, Pinakin bhai, for the wonderful session on the budget. Before I just make a couple of announcements for the forthcoming events. One is on next week, Feb 10th, we have building a professional service firm, characteristics, challenges, and leadership. It's going to be a panel discussion moderated by Sharik bhai, and on Feb 10th at 6:15 p.m. Another two courses which are being launched is the 21st course on double taxation avoidance agreement, which is spreaded over 7 Fridays, 7 Saturdays, and 6 Sundays, a 20-day course starting on 12th of Feb. If participants want to take the benefit of that courses. And the 15th RSC on GST has been announced, which is on 6th of June. So this could be taken. Apart from that, there are two courses, one on IDEA and another one on forensics, which are also available if the participants wants to take benefit of those. With this, I would also like to today take this opportunity to thank Pinakin bhai for giving a wonderful session today on complete detailed line-by-line analysis of the taxation provisions in the budget, which definitely enlightens all of us and brings a lot of things to discuss and open up in terms of e-commerce and others. So thank you, Pinakin bhai, for the wonderful session and giving your time, your efforts to analyze that in such a short span of time and to give a complete detailed analysis of the same. So we, on behalf of BCS, thank you for all your efforts taken today, and we applaud it with a round of applause. With this, I would also like to thank Raj Malik from Reliance and Gandharv Tongia from Polycab for their compliments in this budget session. I would also like to thank the BCS and the FTC team for their relentless efforts to make this program a success, a first-time tried program on virtual image backgrounds. So I would like to thank both BCS team and FTC team for working relentlessly to get this program successful. So thank you all for your kind efforts, and once again thank you, Pinakin bhai, for the wonderful session taken. Thanks.
The BCS budget publication will be available from tomorrow at BCS office. So please take the benefit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.